Now, just a little warning before we begin, there are going to be some major spoilers in this video for the 5th episode of Season 3 of The Bad Batch. So if you haven't seen it yet and you're planning to and don't want anything ruined, it is a really good time to click away. Alright, so the very first thought that went through my head when this episode started and we saw Omega waking up and looking up at freedom, essentially, instead of staring through the bars like she did at the beginning of the season while she was still locked up on Tantus. And don't get me wrong, I liked this scene in itself. It was a good reminder as to where she's been or what she's been through thus far. But my very first thought, given the way last week's episode ended with Crosshair coming home to his brothers and they have this almost standoff before the episode ends on a kind of cliffhanger, you could say. But I was thinking, oh no, they're going to pull an Ahsoka on us, meaning they're just going to skip or ignore a really big and important and potentially very interesting conversation. Much like the one that was avoided in that show in the Ahsoka series when Ezra never talks to Sabine about how she found him in a whole other galaxy and what she may have had to literally give up to do so. She gave the map to Balin and endangered the entire galaxy for him, for Ezra, for the chance to find and save him, and the two never discuss this or even mention it, which is particularly odd when you consider how un-Jedi-like that decision was by Sabine. It was a selfish one, not unlike Anakin's actually, to want to save one person at the potential expense of, well, everyone else. And it was kind of the exact opposite of the decision Ezra made in the first place that got him stranded in the other galaxy. But I digress, and thankfully, or maybe sadly in a way, this show is just flat out better written than that. And instead of the writers and or showrunners kind of skipping over this huge moment and discussion that you'd figure at the very least Crosshair and Hunter would have, they instead devote the entire episode to it and have it where it wasn't the writers who skipped it, but it was actually Hunter and Crosshair who skipped talking about this and trying to hash things out between them. This whole episode was more or less about the tension between those two, and can Hunter truly trust Crosshair after everything he's done? And what did he, Crosshair, do to fall from the good graces of the Empire? And pretty much the whole time there is almost this childishness about it, or how they're dealing with each other, or acting towards each other. It even almost comes to blows at one point, which actually at the end of the episode, Echo makes a joke about that. That's usually how they kind of take care of things. There's blood involved, kind of like brothers will sometimes hash things out when they are particularly younger. But anyway, this childishness might not have made a whole lot of sense or worked as well if not for this very subtle reminder from Omega.
You are still a kid.
I'm older than you are, little brother.
And so what you have to keep in mind here is that though they, the Bad Batch, were trained to be soldiers, good soldiers who follow orders, they were never trained how to deal with their feelings or how to handle a situation like this one. Nor do they have the life experiences from their youth because of the accelerated aging to figure out how to deal with something like this either. They're not prepared to have to grapple with their emotions, they're prepared to grapple with battle droids. Not that adults always are very grown up or know how to initiate talks like this either, but you get my point. And speaking of being an adult, in many ways Omega almost feels like the adult in this episode or in this situation where she has to deal with two fighting children and get them to work it out somehow.
I said talk to him, not argue with him.
He started it.
And I actually think this all works rather well. Again, I think it makes sense that these two don't know how to deal with this or talk to each other about this. And that, of course, Hunter, to protect his family, he would have his doubts about Crosshair and would again wonder about what happened between him and the Empire that got him locked up. And what better place for an episode dealing with Crosshair's fallout with the Empire to take place at than the place where Crosshair betrayed the Empire in the name of his brothers, or his other brothers, perhaps I should say. The clones that had been stationed at this outpost and all but abandoned or used as kind of fodder by the Empire to protect shipments of armor that they weren't allowed to wear, as seen last season in one of the best episodes of this show ever, I would say. And one of the best moments in this episode was Crosshair essentially honoring Mayday and the other fallen clones when he finds their helmets just kind of randomly tossed into a corner. Once again here, as is virtually always the case with this show and with Kevin Kiner, the music or the score is absolutely perfect and captures the emotions flawlessly. Though perhaps I'm getting just a bit ahead of myself, and I should go back to the beginning to when Crosshair is doing some target practice and we see his hand is again shaking. And what's interesting about that is later on when Crosshair and Hunter are finally kind of confronting each other the first time, and Hunter says he betrayed them, Crosshair's hand immediately begins to shake.
What did you do to finally get on the Empire's bad side? Betray them, like you did with us?
It's also worth noting that during the end of the episode, during the encounter with the giant ice monster, or whatever you'd like to call it, we don't really see Crosshair having any problems with his hand shaking. Maybe a little, but certainly not as much as we have seen. So it almost seems like this perhaps has all just been in his head, and that as he repairs things with his brothers, his hand improves, or maybe I'm dead wrong about that, we'll have to see. Though, speaking of giant ice monsters, I couldn't help but chuckle a bit when Wrecker said this.
Why? Why is there always a huge monster?
Because yeah, I kind of thought or felt the same way. It almost felt like the show was being self-aware for a moment, that it realizes how often it does include giant monsters. And I mean, I know that monsters or giant creatures are just one of those Star Wars things, and I'm more than cool with that. I love the creatures of Star Wars. It's one of the best parts of it. But the Bad Batch do run into a lot of them, and it goes along with something I brought up in last week's review when so many seemed to think I was calling that episode filler, when I certainly wasn't. I said the show can be rather formulaic at times. It tends to use the same premise over and over again. The one where they have to go to a planet to get something, then something happens, like a giant monster is there, and they have to defeat the monster somehow and get away in the end. And pointing that out doesn't mean I hate the show. I really enjoy the show, and this season has been fantastic thus far. I also understand that, sure, a lot of episodes are indeed going to have a more simple formula almost by default or because of time constraints on it, where you generally have a little over 20 minutes to do a kind of self-contained story, and for whatever reason they haven't fully embraced the multi-episode arcs approach like the Clone Wars did in the later seasons of it. Though I will say this season of The Bad Batch has felt far more like a cohesive overarching narrative than the previous two have. Again, it's been pretty fantastic thus far. But I once again digress, and this episode also saw the return of Echo, and was kind of a reminder of why I think he left or was taken out of the show by the writers, that being they never seemed to know exactly what to do with him or what role to give him before, or when Tech was still around, I should say. Those two almost seem to overlap in the tech guy department, if you will. But with Tech now gone, and there was a great moment where he was kind of brought up, that was very kind of touching and impactful.
Imperial encryption will be a problem. Especially without Tech.
But with Tech gone, that very much leaves Echo to fill that kind of vacated role now, even if he admits he's not as good as Tech once was at it. And I'm still convinced, or really hoping, as much as I enjoyed the character of Tech, especially in Season 2, but I'm really hoping he is indeed going to stay dead. In the end then, after the mission to crack into the datapad is successful, though they didn't seem to get as much information as they had hoped for, they didn't get the location of Tantus, but learned even more clones are being held there than they thought. But in the end, Hunter and Crosshair finally talk and hug it out, figuratively. There was no literal hugging. They seem to come to an understanding, and Crosshair acknowledges his mistakes and that he wants to be better. And that is, in true Star Wars fashion, him being well on the way to redemption. But oftentimes redemption in Star Wars comes with it a price. And this rather haunting and foreboding line from Hunter, I think, implies we're going to be getting anything but a happy ending for this team.
And who knows? There just might be hope for us yet.
The very end of the episode is then Crosshair watching as the giant predatory bird that we saw throughout the episode, and that was very prominent in last season's episode on this planet, and seemed to be almost this mirror of Crosshair. It was this creature, kind of like Crosshair, that could survive virtually anything, and it mainly survived just for the sake of surviving it. Well, Crosshair watches it fly off almost as if it's saying goodbye to him, because once again, Crosshair has found his place and his purpose with his brothers, until disaster inevitably comes. And so, in closing, another very solid and enjoyable, mainly character-driven episode with, yes, the same sort of story or formula we have seen many times before, but you could certainly say it was just the backdrop they chose in order for Crosshair and Hunter to be able to work things out and to trust each other again. and they do literally work them out or have to work together against the ice monster, though it was mainly Crosshair having to save Hunter in this case, though something tells me, if I had to make a guess or a bet at this point, that in the end, the very end of this series, it'll be Hunter saving Crosshair. Something tells me he'll be the one that doesn't make it out of the show alive, but only time will tell if I'm right or not. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it is your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you thought of this episode and which members of the Bad Batch do you expect to live and which do you expect to not live when this is all said and done. Whatever you think, leave those comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.